Well, personal relationships are important in politics and in diplomacy, and I think never more so than with someone like Donald Trump, who is a very specific figure. He's not part of the American political establishment. He prides himself on not being part of the establishment. He often takes contrarian positions, and he's very much someone who believes in the power of personality. So, having a good relationship with him, a personal relationship with him, is very important. And Zelensky's not had that in the past. They famously had a lot of problems. We had the impeachment scandal back in 2019, which Zelensky got dragged into against his will, and it probably did quite well, actually, but it was a very difficult situation to handle, and it left a lot of bad feeling toward Ukraine and towards Zelensky personally, I think, within the Trump camp. There's been a lot of bad blood since then, and of course, in February, we saw that all sort of boil over in this in these dramatic and frankly unprecedented scenes in the Oval Office. So there's been a lot of tension there in the personal relationship. It seems now that the two leaders have a much better relationship. They're getting on better personally. They're talking about this now. Zelensky himself talked about that afterwards when he gave an interview to Fox News. He said they've had a chance to spend more time together, get to know each other a little bit better. I would say they probably have quite a lot in common. They both come from show business backgrounds to a degree. Trump spent many years as a TV host, and in many respects that was the platform that launched him to the presidency. Of course, Zelensky was the same, even more so. He used his showbiz profile to launch his political career. But they're both very charismatic figures. Yes, I think there's probably room there for a good personal relationship once they get beyond some of the political aspects. And also another point that Zelensky made was that Trump has been lied to so consistently by Putin, someone who he did think was his friend, and who he did think he had a good relationship with, and who he was very proud of having a good relationship with. And now I think he feels that he's been taken for a ride, that he's been played by Putin, that Putin has fooled him consistently and lied to him, simply lied. So, of course, that would make him perhaps, very resentful toward Russia and Putin himself. It may also make him feel more sympathetic towards Ukraine and more ready to take Zelensky's side on certain issues, or at least listen to him. So, every time they meet is a bonus, is a positive meeting, I would say, at this stage. And yesterday's, judging by what we saw in the meeting, judging by what came out of the meeting, what was said by Trump himself and by Zelensky, it seems to have been probably the best meeting they've had so far.
In his one of the most pro-Ukrainian statements, Donald Trump mentioned that ordinary Russians are starting to feel the effect of the war, like long queues for petrol and bad economy. From your perspective, how much are Russians really feeling the consequences, and could it push them to demand a change the course of this war?
Well, it's very interesting that Trump made those points, actually. In his post, he very specifically mentioned that Russia was not doing well militarily or economically. And I think this is perhaps the most interesting aspect of his entire post yesterday, was the fact that he clearly referenced he's obviously getting intelligence from his team. The American intel community is probably the best in the world, certainly the largest in the world, the most with the greatest resources. We know they have a lot of people inside Russia. We know that going back to 2021, 2022, when they were able to predict with very significant accuracy exactly how the invasion would play out. So they clearly have a lot of good inside information from Russia, and I think it's clear from what Trump says that he is being told, his team is telling him, his intelligence team is telling him, Russia is not doing well. They're not doing well on the battlefield, and they're not doing well domestically, economically. That's something I think which is slowly beginning to dawn on a lot of people, as well as Trump. It's becoming clearer and clearer to people, especially the military aspect, that Russia is not winning this war. That for a long time, there's been the sense of inevitability that Russia will win this war eventually because it's so big. Russia always wins its wars and so on, and it will eventually just grind out this victory. a lot of people now are looking and saying, well, hold on, they've just had this big summer offensive, they achieved almost nothing with huge casualties yet again. You know, over the last 3 years, essentially, they've made very, very minimal gains. They're not achieving any breakthroughs. All this talk of Ukraine's impending collapse, Russia's impending victory, is basically Kremlin wishful thinking. And more people are starting to recognize this now. Now, to come back to your original question, do the Russians recognize this themselves? I would say probably not yet, no, not hugely, but I think the shortages of fuel, of petrol, is the biggest single impact for many of them of the entire war. This will be the first time Russians have personally felt that their lives have been negatively impacted by the war. And it's happening across Russia. We see footage from petrol stations, gas stations all over the country. There's big queues. There's no petrol in a lot of places, even in major cities. That is having a big impact on Russians, and that's making them realise that things aren't going as well as the television is telling them, as they're hearing from the Kremlin media, from the Kremlin, the state propaganda, that things aren't going so well. You know, the Russians are very, I would say, comfortable with the heavy losses in the military sphere. They don't care. Putin certainly doesn't care, and he's done a lot to isolate and insulate the Russian people there. Those people who are dying in Ukraine, they're volunteers mostly now. They're dying because they went to Ukraine to make money, and it was their choice. So very few people have any sympathy for them in Russia. No one's rushing to protest about the injustice of people being killed in a war they went to voluntarily to make money. You know, so that is not a big issue for the Russians. They can lose a lot more men. As long as Russians are ready to die for money, no problem. They can keep going. So that's not a big issue. But if the economy in Russia starts to collapse, and the lack of petrol in an energy superpower is a pretty strong signal of impending collapse, I would say, or certainly of systemic dysfunction, you know, at a very, very core level. So this is going to send alarm bells out throughout Russian society. Now, the final point you mentioned, will they do anything about it? Probably not. The Russian people have been cowed. They're very, very passive. They don't believe in protest. They don't believe in their ability to influence anything in their own country. They're very fatalistic about that. That's the political culture that has existed in Russia for centuries, but certainly under Putin has been cultivated. But you may see local power brokers recognizing that the centre is losing its power. They may start to withdraw their support to some degree. They may start looking to consolidate their own power bases locally, regionally, within the republics of Russia. You know, so it could set up all sorts of dangerous trends within Russia that could destabilize the country. I don't think we're talking about mass protests. We might talk about other forms of resistance and other forms of a weakening of the state, a weakening of the economy, and a weakening of the war machine. So I personally think that this campaign against the oil refineries in Russia is by far the most effective strategy that Ukraine could adopt, and the most realistic peace plan, so to speak. The question now is whether they can take it to the next level and really go from the current level, around 20% perhaps of Russian refinery activity disrupted, up to 40 to